Please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Graham Harman.
How's the microphone? Can you all hear me fine? Slavoj has insisted tonight that we call him by his first name, and I'm going to try to force myself to do that. Usually I call famous authors by their family name because I've always worried about the borrowed glory of a false intimacy of calling somebody by first name, but we'll do as he asks. I used to tell my friends that Slavoj was the only philosopher I'd pay $100 to see live, and before tonight I had the chance to see him 5 times, and all of those were free. And this is number 6, and imagine my surprise to discover that Harman removed $100 from my paycheck. Well, in some ways we're opposites. I'm an object-oriented philosopher, and you could call Slavoj one of the major subject-oriented philosophers, along with his compatriot, or his colleague, Alain Badiou. But there are some things that I really gravitate towards in his writing. First of all, I think philosophers should be funny. Too few of them are. And I would have to say that Slavoj is probably the first Western philosopher since Giordano Bruno in the 1500s who could probably have made a living as a stand-up comic if he had to. Now, of course, Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600. I doubt that's going to be Slavoj's fate, but in a different time, perhaps, you can imagine a situation where it could have gone that direction. Also, simply the animal energy of his writings and his public speaking. When I started graduate school in the early 1990s, there was a certain way of writing that I know he hates also, that involves putting everything in parentheses and quotation marks, and this is simply de-energizing and debilitating, and he avoids this wonderfully. He simply takes a stand on everything and challenges you to disagree. But here are some differences. You could say that Slavoj belongs to a modern tradition of philosophy, whereas I would say that I belong to what I call a non-modern tradition of philosophy that's more recent. I'm stealing that term non-modern from Bruno Latour. Slavoj would say that we are seeking a re-enchantment of the world after the alienation of modernity, whereas I would say the world was never disenchanted in the first place. We've always been fascinated by the world. We've always been entangled with it and involved with it. Another thing, an issue I have with modern philosophy is that modern philosophy is in many ways a taxonomy. It says there are at least 2 different kinds of beings, thought and world, or nature and spirit, or human and world. It starts by saying there are 2 totally different kinds of things, and they both need a different ontology to handle them properly. The human thought needs one kind of ontology, nature needs another ontology. Whereas, by the way, I see this as an extension of the medieval taxonomy, which was between creator and created. There were 2 also basic kinds of things for medieval ontology. Whereas in non-modern philosophy, we start with what we call a flat ontology, which means we start off by assuming that everything has to be treated in the same terms. So we start off by assuming that the human being is simply an object like others. Yes, a very interesting object to us, an object that has lots of talents, perhaps, that chairs and tables do not, but an object nonetheless, and that you cannot start off by inscribing what's special about humans into the very foundation of philosophy. That has to come later. And so you have to start off, this is why we give long lists a lot in object-oriented ontology. I'll say paper, grasshoppers, the planet Mars, chemicals, and so forth. You'll find 9 or 10 of these objects in a row. It's an attempt to create that sense of flattening for the reader. All right, there's also a kind of philosophy that I would call neo-modern philosophy, which I think describes Slavoj's position a little more accurately. I should say that neo usually is taken as a derogatory prefix. If you call somebody neo something or other, it often means that you're just accusing them of rehashing the original version. That's not what I mean here. By neo-modern philosophy, I mean the kind that doesn't stay with a simple opposition between subject and object, but that tends to assimilate the object into the subject in some way. And so this starts with authors like Maimon and Fichte, the ones immediately after Kant, where Kant said there is a thing in itself out there that we can think about, but we can never know. These critiques of Kant tended to say that that itself is a performative contradiction, because if you're thinking a thing outside thought, that itself is a thought, and therefore it makes no sense to talk about this thing in itself that's outside of thought. The thing in itself has to somehow be inscribed in the thought, the circle of thought already. You find a lot of this in Slavoj's work, you find it in Badiou's, you also find it in Quentin Meillassoux of my own generation. It also has an inverse, which I would call arch-modernism, which is where they're reducing the subject to the object, say to cognitive science, a way of trying to minimize the modern difference by letting science be the dominant discourse. And what Slavoj tells us in a number of his publications is that the way Hegel radicalized Kant by getting rid of the thing in itself is also the way that Lacan radicalized Freud. So that the unconscious in Freud is in some sense a real thing, a quasi-biological entity that's there, hidden beneath appearance. for Lacan, that's not really true. The unconscious occurs in the gaps and ruptures on the surface. There's not really a hidden place where the unconscious is. Now, what I would say is that neo-modern philosophy radicalizes Kant in the wrong way. It tends to say that the problem with Kant, this great genius, is that he allowed for finitude, this idea that humans cannot reach the thing in itself because we are only experiencing according to space-time and the 12 categories of the understanding, and so we can never get at the thing outside there. And the neo-modern philosophers tend to try to get rid of this finitude, which they distrust. I would go the other way. I think the finitude is insurmountable. I think the problem with Kant is that he left the human-world relation at the center of philosophy, and it's the only real relation he can talk about. Kant doesn't really allow you to talk about the collision of two inanimate entities, except insofar as we are talking about it, and therefore the conditions of human experience apply to discussing that. So I think what should have happened is people should have said Kant is a genius precisely because of the finitude. He just shouldn't have reduced it to the human-world gap, so that we poor humans can't reach the end itself. It's a problem of the subject, of the human being. For me, the same problem happens when inanimate objects collide. To take the old example from Islamic philosophy, when fire burns cotton, the fire is not making contact with all the properties of the cotton, but only with a caricature or a translation or a distortion of the cotton. And so there's no direct contact possible in the inanimate world either, and so the same problem that happens in the subject happens in the inanimate world as well. This is one of the central principles of O, as we call object-oriented ontology. So if you want to speak about this counterfactually in terms of the history of philosophy, instead of a German idealism, there could have been a German realism at that same moment that took the path I've just sketched. And it was quite plausible because German philosophy at the time was very much under the influence of Leibniz, and Leibniz also allows for this world of non-human things mirroring each other and reflecting each other. This could have happened. So in a way, O is just trying to create German idealism 200 years after it first could have been born. All right, now realism. This is another probable difference between us. I know Slavoj doesn't like being called an idealist always, but he certainly wouldn't call himself a realist, I don't think. Realism is sometimes also called naive realism, as if there were other kinds, according to these critics. They think all the realism is naive. And this means, according to them, the idea that there's a reality outside the mind, that the mind has nothing to do with constructing. I think that's the wrong way to define naive realism. I think naive realism is the kind of realism that thinks there's a world outside the mind and I can know it. That's the first problem, because I think the real is so real that it cannot be known. It can be gotten at indirectly. It's not completely inaccessible, but it's inaccessible only through what I call allure. Something is summoning you, something is drawing you, with aesthetics being a very clear case of that. Something is summoning you without being directly accessible. That's one problem with what they call naive realism. Adrian Johnston, who among many other things is one of the best interpreters of Slavoj that we have, claims that I will be left with nothing but negative theology if I take this path. But that assumes that there's only two options. You either know something or you don't. Whereas this is what is called Meno's paradox. This is what Socrates criticizes, the idea that you already know something or you don't. I think the truth is that we are somewhere in between those. And this is the foundation for philosophia in the Greek meaning of it, that it's a love of wisdom. You never attain the wisdom. You're always somewhere in between there. And I think also this is what aesthetics is about. Aesthetics is not a kind of knowledge any more than philosophy is, and this holds for architecture as well as the arts. You obviously make use of knowledge in architecture, just as we do in philosophy, but you are not primarily producing knowledge. That's a side effect in most of what you're doing in architecture. You're producing something else. You're producing something that's not ever fully knowable, not ever fully paraphrasable in literal terms, in terms of you can say literally what the 25 qualities of this building are. You can try that, but it's never going to work. So aesthetics is very central for O. And how am I doing on time, Anna? Fine?
I think so.
Okay. Here's another problem I have with naive realism. People always say realism is the view that something exists outside the mind. Who says that the mind is the only thing with an outside? There's an outside also when two objects interact. And I say that there's a reality outside of that interaction. When the fire burns the cotton, there's a cotton outside of what the fire interacts with. And so realism is something that affects not just us, something outside our mind. It implies also something outside of objects when they interact. So objects translate each other, just as we translate them. Alfred North Whitehead got a glimpse of this in his wonderful sort of throwback philosophy in the 1920s, but Whitehead for me is too relational. He reduces objects to their relations with other things, whereas O is all about the irreducibility of objects to their relations. So, what is an example where Slavoj seems to be an anti-realist? I'll take one of my favorite examples from The Sublime Object of Ideology, which was not his first book, but his breakthrough book, the book that really made him known to a wide audience, from 1989. And that is his very interesting remarks on anti-Semitism. He makes there a very interesting claim that if somebody just says Jews conspire and manipulate, That's not quite anti-Semitism yet. The anti-Semitism is the next step where you say they conspire and manipulate because they're Jews. In other words, there's some hidden essential core that's causing the conspiracies and manipulation. Fascinating idea, but I would put it somewhat differently. It sounds there like he's saying that the mistake is in saying that Jewishness is some sort of real entity outside of all the individual cases. Now, if an anti-Semite were to make anti-Semitic remarks, you would, of course, say you shouldn't generalize, right? Jews are individual people, each with their own qualities and traits, and you can't generalize about a whole group. That is something you would and should say. However, I would take a different tack in responding to the anti-Semite. I would say that you cannot know what that essence is. And I'm going to show this by making a parallel critique of Edward Said's. Edward Said, I could never say anything against him in Cairo because he was a kind of saint on campus. And I was very happy to have a major person writing in the US media defending the Palestinian side. But there's a problem with his major book, Orientalism. There are several problems, but the problem I'm going to talk about here is at one point in the book, he relies on the argument that you can't generalize about the Orient. And of course, Orient's too big a term in its colonialist use. It referred to the Middle East and to the Far East and so forth. But leaving that aside, he says at one point in the book that you can't generalize, everybody's an individual, right? There are just a lot of individuals in the Middle East. You can't make a sweeping statement about what the Orient is. But then it occurred to me that that is close to the ontology of Margaret Thatcher, who says that society doesn't exist. There's only families and individuals. And the fact is, we do try to learn things about culture as a whole. When I went to Egypt for the first time in 2000, there were a lot of things I had to learn about Middle Eastern culture. You can put your foot in your mouth if you don't. You have to learn a lot of things about what can be said, what can't be said. One of my students in Cairo who spoke fluent English had a night job telemarketing to the US, and he had to take a culture course about Americans. So I got to see that in reverse, and it was hilarious. They taught him you can't ask Americans if they're married, you can't ask them their salary, all things that are very normal for a taxi driver in Cairo to ask you. So it wouldn't make much sense to say that there's no such thing as Egyptian culture or Middle Eastern culture. You should be able to say something about it. I think the problem with Orientalism and the problem with essentialism comes when somebody claims to know it. So in other words, it's not Orientalist to say Egyptian culture is different in some ways from English culture. The problem comes when you say, we know that the Middle Eastern peoples are incapable of self-rule, and therefore they need a viceroy to come from Europe and command them. This is where the anti-Semitism, the racism, the bad essentialism come in. I don't think there's a problem with essence as such. And I think one of the problems with recent theory is it's been too suspicious of the notion of essence. It takes away the realist part of theory. Because if everything has its own character, then everything has an essence for that very reason. It's a changeable essence maybe, but it's an essence. And in fact, this is how Aristotle defines substance. Substance, another much beleaguered concept today in contemporary philosophy. The most interesting definition Aristotle gives of substance is it's the thing that can have different qualities at different times. So white is always white and sad is always sad, but Socrates can be happy one minute and sad the next. That's what makes him a substance. The most interesting human characters are often capable of different polarizations of personality at different times. The famous sinner-saint polarity. You've got Paul, who's the persecutor of the Christians and then becomes the apostle of the Christians. And I've always been fascinated by the example of Scandinavia, now known for the most humane social democracy in Europe, but they were once the marauding Vikings. So what's the proper reaction to that? I don't think it would be to say necessarily that there is no essence to Scandinavian civilization. It probably means that there is, but it's something deeper than either marauding or social democracy. Those are surface properties. And we might get into this if we come to quantum theory lately, which I know Slavoj likes a lot. All right, so let me just, do I have time for a few brief remarks before I wrap it up? Okay.
Inclusive, yeah.
All right. Now, one issue that's going to come up tonight is that objects for me are non-relational. Objects are that which resist any reduction to their components or to their outward effects. And so objects for me are non-relational. And I know sometimes Slavoj seems to agree with that, as when he was reading my immaterialism book recently, but sometimes he talks, when he's writing against Levi Bryant, he said that the subject is nothing but a pure network of relations. So I want to hear what he says about that. Architecturally, there is an implication here, and I'll refer to Patrick Schumacher again. In his huge manifesto, 2-volume Autopoiesis of Architecture, which I learned a lot from actually as a newcomer to architecture, he borrows Luhmann's terminology and says that architecture is about framing social communications. I think it cannot be that, or it cannot be just that. You're not creating communication, you're also creating non-communication. You're making discrete things with an inside, and that inside does not completely communicate with the outside. So architecture has to be, at least in large part, about non-communication. And one of my favorite moments in Patrick's book is when he says, you know, every architectural theory has its vices, and I have to admit my vice is I don't know where to put the doors and windows. because everything's supposed to be a gradient and flowing naturally, and so it becomes kind of arbitrary way to articulate the building. And I think that's a serious problem. And David Rue, in a very nice piece that he wrote in TARP, Architectural Manual, a few years ago, talked about the worry that with the excessive concern with how the building flows into its environments, gradually, gently, without any discernible break-off, that architecture could blend into ecology and disappear, that everything could become about the carbon footprint, and there could be no autonomy to the discipline. So I would worry about bringing too much relationality into architecture. And another way that relationality is usually brought into a lot of fields is to bring the socio-political relationality into it. Now, I'm not enough of a formalist to say that an aesthetic work cannot communicate with any of the socio-political circumstances. Of course it can, and there are obvious examples like Uncle Tom's Cabin or Picasso's Guernica, and the list goes on. However, I don't think that they arbitrarily include everything in their environment. It's a very selective process by which an object assimilates influences from its environment, and we have to know more about how that process occurs before we simply shoot the moon and say, everything's social and political, there's nothing outside of ideology, there's nothing outside of politics. So I guess I will leave it there. Thank you. Hope that wasn't too long.
Does it work? I hope it works also.
It works.
Yeah, okay. I see a problem today. The topic you indicated is so fundamental that I have no illusions that we will arrive at. It would be a great success if we just somehow clarify where the difference really is. Because I think the biggest problem in so-called philosophical dialogues, it's not who is right, but in what does the difference reside in the first place. And here I'm pretty much a pessimist. I think the entire history of philosophy is a history of one guy allegedly superseding the other, but really misreading him. For example, as an old Plato admirer, I claim it's clear how Aristotle misread Plato, or to go later, it's clear that Kant misread Leibniz and the previous philosophers. Fichte, Schelling misread Kant, Hegel misread all of them. My favorite example, if any guy didn't understand Hegel, it was Marx, and so on and so on. So let's just be modest, and I will just try to mark some differences. There are so many things to say. First, already beginning with that Latour thesis, we were never modern and so on. I'm here a naive, I admit it openly, a naive believer in modernity. I claim that, that with modernity, something happens at the level of science, modern science, at the level of politics, at the level of subjectivity and so on, which simply cannot be dismissed as just another form of enchantment and so on and so on. Just look at politics, whatever doubts we do have, but the whole political vision of French Revolution is something radically new. That's just one point on which I would insist. Then let's go on. Maybe one of the differences that we have is, although you have some sympathy for Heidegger, but if there ever was a thinker, I claim, who is radically historicist and transcendental, it's Heidegger. Here I never got your reference to quadruple objects, how you link it with Heidegger, because when Heidegger speaks about das Geviert, the quadruple, his point is, of course, not in the usual Kantian sense, but in more radical sense, transcendental. What do I mean by transcendental? It's simply the idea that because of our finitude, we never speak from a void. We are always thrown into certain pre-understanding of the world, which is always, they like, transcendental thinkers did phrase, always already here. You never encounter, as you know very well, you never encounter simply things the way they are. You always approach them from a certain historically specific horizon. And for Heidegger, Germans have this beautiful term, unhintergehbar, what you cannot step behind. For example, for Heidegger, each epoch is characterized by a certain disclosure of being. In modernity, objects, what is really objective is just object of science, quantifiable, all other things are subjective expressions, and so on and so on. In medieval times, reality appeared in a different way, and so on and so on. Now, what I agree with, where I do agree with you, is that we should step beyond the transcendental. The transcendental circle, this circle of always already, simply is not strong enough to confront us with today's problems. Let me take the one who is for me the ultimate transcendentalist, Jürgen Habermas. When we have the threat that biogenetics will objectivize us, he pulls a simple Habermas, a simple transcendental trick. His reasoning is, but even if I objectify you as a neuronal mechanism, in doing this, I already presuppose certain rational argumentation and so on, which is a priori here, which cannot be itself objectivized in this way. So, whichever way we approach reality, a transcendental horizon is here. And to be slightly sarcastic, that's how Habermas ended up doing a book together with Ratzinger, with the Pope, you know, rejecting biogenetics. So, again, I think that transcendental approach is something very harsh, and one can even read you in a loving way, not critically, your works as transcendental in the sense that, for example, you're wonderful and your ontology is very powerful. Description of reality, it's a certain vision that is simply here and you describe. It's a kind of a priori. It's not that you just look at the world and, oh my God, you discovered it is like this. And I agree with you, here we also agree that, and here we are all followers of Quentin Meillassoux, that the transcendental dimension shouldn't be the last horizon, because then you end in this Heideggerian deadlock. We just have a succession of different transcendental horizons and so on and so on. So here I would say the transcendental problem is much stronger. But let's go on more interesting topics. I like what you said. It's a wonderful formulation about how it's not only either subjectivism, we constitute reality, or reality is out there unknowable, or reality is out there we can know it. My position would have been here, the fourth one, maybe more subtle. Yes, I agree with you. Reality is out there impenetrable. We cannot ever fully get at it. What I would have done, and probably you would disagree, is to add an additional, sorry for the implicit obscenity, turn of the screw, and to add that I always was fascinated by this wonderful saying of Hegel. It's not literally like this, but more or less he says it, that the secrets of the Egyptians were also the secrets for the Egyptians themselves. That is to say, I don't think there is a reality in itself which is just impenetrable to us. What if, and that's how in my naive way I read one of the lessons of quantum physics, what if this impenetrability is, and I mean this in the most radical sense imaginable, a feature of reality itself. Reality is not just out there, we cannot get at it. Reality is in itself flawed, imperfect, antagonistic, it's incomplete in itself. That's why, if I can tell another story, probably you know it, which I love it, the best quantum physics joke. I read this in some simple introduction to philosophy. It's my favorite philosophical narrative. The idea is this one, to understand, and this is the big conflict in philosophy, what are the ontological consequences of quantum physics? They claim, imagine a video game. You move in it, and you see some trees in the background, a forest. You cannot go there and see the forests, the trees, from close up, because simply the game is not programmed in this way. If you come too close to the trees, you just see some vague dots, contours. Why? Because it's not part of the game, universe the way it's constructed, that you can go there. So in this wonderful reading that I like, it goes on like this, that the lesson of quantum physics is that God constructed our world like a lazy computer designer. He said, oh, in the same way that in a computer game, you know, it happens on a certain field where you kill Pokemons, fight, whatever, but you are not meant to go back close to that door. Or the house, just the outside is constructed, because so why should God lose time constructing the inside? And the idea, it's a wonderful, ironic idea, it's a good philosophy, is that we, as it were, caught God with his pants down. God thought, that's this ironic reading of quantum physics, God thought, oh, these stupid humans will never go beyond the structure of atom. So we can leave it ontologically incomplete. Why should I lose time constructing? But we were a little bit too bright for God. You know, we went there and we found indeterminacy and so on and so on. And that's the big difference between Heisenberg and Bohr. Heisenberg still thought that indeterminacy is just epistemological. We cannot have it both ways, velocity and position, but in themselves particles have both properties. Bohr goes further, they don't have. So that would be my, as it were, addition, that this imperfection is part of reality itself. Reality in itself is, in this sense, imperfect. It's not that there is full reality out there, we just don't get it. I mean, I'm not denying that there are aspects which are unknown to us and so on, but that, again, imperfection is out there. The second thing I would add here, I mean, I'm so sorry, stop me when I speak to you because I have so many things to say. Okay, let's not get lost here. Let's go to the topic of subject. I always think, maybe I am wrong, that the problem with O is for me that, okay, it's easy to say subject is ultimately just another object. In a certain way, of course it is. I mean, we don't exist without bodily substance and so on and so on. But what I would have said is that modern subjectivity is not simply a meta-actant, meta-agent, like an object which or who doesn't want to be just an object but wants to posit the entire world and so on and so on. Subject is, for me, I don't have time to go into it, it's a complex topic, something much more paradoxically, it's more an impassive entity. It's, in a way, this failure, lack of being, in a way, coming out to be existing. Which is why subject for me is not an all-powerful agent. It's just a certain, at its most fundamental, subject is for me a certain, if you want to, structural deadlock, impossibility, passivity. What do I mean by this? Let me go on here. For Lacan, subject does have always an object that it is. It's just that the paradox of subject is that the subject is an object unavailable to itself. To be a subject means radically not to know what for an object I am. And it's not just this, it's that this surplus of not knowing has to be embodied in an additional paradoxical object called by Lacan object small a, the object call of desire, and so on and so on. Which is why I will talk too much, I'm afraid. Which is why for Lacan, you know, when people think, oh, for psychoanalysis, object of desire is forever eluding. Yes, but that object is not out there, I cannot ever reach it. That object is myself. Subject, which is why for Lacan, the ultimate subject in sex terms is a woman with this eternal hysterical question, tell me why you love me. It means tell me what for an object I am, but of course you cannot ever answer it. Object, the true enigma, psychoanalysis has here a wonderful theory of subjectivity. The true enigma is a small child, he or she sees that he or she is manipulated by parents, they want something from you, they play their traumas through you, but it's never clear to you what they want from you, what you are for them. This abyss defines the subject. So subject is not mega strong, subject is, I agree with you, this is my scene for you. Not one among the objects, but not in the sense of we have an objective world and look, that crappy human being wants to be everything. No, subject is for me rather an effect of limitation. Subject means we are in certain horizon, we cannot move beyond. Now I come to another crucial point. I wonder if you would agree. Reality, real. Here, and I find an echo with what you were saying about this, how the thing in itself, it's not that it's out there and then all this naive, in the bad sense, topic, can we grab it or not? We can, but not directly. We can grab it through the very structure of failures to get at it. And if you allow me to conclude slowly, then I have just one more remark to give you an example which I used maybe about 10 times in my books, but I think it's a perfect one. From Lévi-Strauss, in one of his best essays in his structural anthropology, Do Dual Organizations Exist? Lévi-Strauss reports of his experience with some, I think it's even North American, Indian, Native American, I hate the term, it's more racist, I think, than Indian. I spoke with my Indian friends, they all tell me the same thing. I much prefer to be called Indian than Native American. If I'm Native American means what? And you are cultural American, same nature. If I'm Indian, called, at least my name is a monument to white man's stupidity. So who thought they are in India? So what I'm saying is that this is what Lévi-Strauss reports on. He went to a certain village and asked the people there, inhabitants, tribal village, draw me the map of your village. And he noticed that he got two totally different drawings. One was a kind of a hierarchy concentric, the sanctuary with all the rich people's huts and so on in center, and ordinary members around. The other one was more dualist. Rich ruling priests on the one side, the others. But then his idea was, but it's simple to establish what is reality. You take a helicopter, you took a photo and you see how houses are really disposed. So in this sense, you can compare these wrong images with reality. And you can get at it that none of them fits. But then Lévi-Strauss says something wonderful. He says, the point is not that these two images don't fit reality. Their truth is in the way they miss reality. Because in the gap that separates these two images, this very gap, this failure to represent properly social reality, tells you the deepest truth about social reality. That it was class society at its beginning, these two drawings, which both falsify social edifice, register the growing social antagonism. So you see how, although none of them fits reality, the truth is the social antagonism which is registered in this very failure. And coming back to anti-Semitism, that's why I love Lacan's saying, I again often use it, that, I'm sorry, it's a little bit male chauvinist, I could provide to you another version, that if we have a pathologically jealous husband, and even if all his suspicions are true, his wife is sleeping around, blah, blah, his jealousy is still pathological. Because the true point is not, are my obsessions about my wife true or not? The true point is, why do I need this pathological jealousy to maintain my identity? And I claim that would be my approach. It's exactly the same with anti-Semitism. If, let's say I'm in Germany in 1935, I want to debate with not Nazi friend of mine, Nazi guy, the truth about anti-Semitism. The moment I limit the debate to, are Jews really like that, the way you claim, I'm lost. Because if you approach it in this way, the result would be a compromise. Yes, maybe you anti-Semites exaggerate a little bit, but you have a point. Like anti-Semites claim Jews exploit us Germans. Well, up to a point, this was definitely true. Many Jews were rich in a formal sense, they did it. Jews seduce our girls. Well, I hope they did, and I hope the other way around. And you know what I mean? What makes Nazi anti-Semitism pathological is not, is it true or not, what they claim about the Jews. It is, why do they need anti-Semitism to assert their identity, their political vision, and so on and so on? And here I would define truth as opposed to simple knowledge. At the level of simple knowledge, you ask, anti-Semitism claims this, that, is it true or not? But okay, that's the next point. Now to conclude, yeah, immediately. Just one more point, because I have many others. Surprisingly, where we do agree, as we already established, is that I'm also like you, and it may be surprising to some of you, totally on your side against this absolutely predominant doxa today. Whenever you have a debate, I agree with you on the one hand, as you pointed out about Egypt. I mean, this cheap historicism, in the sense of, you know, whenever, that's one safe strategy in today's thinking, whenever you have a principled debate and you are losing, if you take recourse to this cheap historicism. Like, I've been to many feminist debates where the side which was losing said, but wait a minute, woman doesn't exist. There are only prostitutes, wives, single mothers. Which, you know, this cheap relativization, particularization. I totally agree with you. Universality has a certain actuality and so on. Second point, where I agree with you, is this immobilism. Because the other doxa of today is things are dynamic, every fixation, every fixed identity is something which is just a temporary reification, fixation. No, I agree with your wonderful formulas where you claim that, in a way, identity precedes activity. I just would give to it maybe a further twist, so that I don't lose time now. Let's go to your key point, reduction of objects to relations. What would you go as far? Maybe here is the understanding. I agree with you, objects cannot be reduced to a set of relations, especially actual relations. There is always an excess. But I claim, nonetheless, this excess can be generated through relations. Let me take an example similar to your East India Company. Let's take communism. Right. It's a cause. It is totally clear that communism as a cause, and I'm very critical towards it, although I still consider myself a communist, communism as a cause exists only insofar as it is practiced, actualized, debated among humans. It is this paradoxical entity, or all social causes are like this. They exist only through incessant activity of individuals. But nonetheless, I agree with you, they cannot be reduced to it. That would be my paradox. They can totally depend on relations, but they have an excess. For example, it is, where would be the in itself of communism? Although communism began as the idea of equality, transparency, and so on, it's totally legitimate to ask the question, but isn't there another hidden side of communism? Was Stalinist deviation really just a secondary mistake, or was it an actualization of something that was already originally possible in the idea of communism, and so on and so on? So I don't get it. For example, let's take a case of communism. Isn't it something that, although it is fully rooted in relations, it is alive as an idea only insofar as people debate it, fight for it, and so on, it still has an in itself. But it's a paradoxical in itself, which, again, that's the paradox I would insist on. It doesn't exist outside relations, but its posited by relations themselves as there in itself, as something transcendent, getting over them, and so on and so on. Okay, I have many other things to say. I will not now lose time. For example, when you mentioned objectivity and so on.
Slavoj, I'm going to interrupt.
I already told her before that he should act as if she is a domina with a black leg, and you are now whipping me, and I agree. Okay, I stop. Sorry.